Thanks very much, John. Unfortunately, due to a certain airline, I missed most of this morning. Just came in halfway through Dave Barry's fantastic presentation, and someone sitting at my table said, "You were nodding all the way through that." And I was indeed. So I'm looking forward to further chats with Dave as part of this commission thing that John's got going on tomorrow. Look, John's given you all the background to why I'm here, so I'll move into this pretty quick smart. I'm at a slight disadvantage in having missed both Felicity Ann and Jeff Kennett, because I wanted to start by putting this issue of structural reform in some kind of context. And I think probably both of them have things to say this morning that are relevant to this. One of the starting points for the New South Wales Local Government Review that I chaired was that you can only understand local government if you think about systems of government. If you think about local government just as a bunch of councils, it doesn't actually get you very far. So the first thing is local government is government. It's not an industry, it's not a business, it's not your local bowling club on a grand scale. It's government, and things flow from that. And one of the things that flows from it is that it's not just about service delivery. There's all those other things that local government does. Planning and economic development and relating to other levels of government and so on, which is fundamentally important when we start thinking about our structures. Because a lot of the shared services discussion revolves around the notion that if we sort out service delivery, we've sorted out local government. And that, in my view, is completely wrong. One of the other things that flows from being government is that you are always having to make changes. A lot of people in New South Wales with our review said, what are these people on about? We just want to get back to core business, back to basics. Pick up the garbage, fix the roads, leave us alone. Well, it'd be nice if you could turn the clock back that far, but unfortunately, the bull has well and truly escaped through the gate on that one. It means that actually trying to define core business for local government is extremely difficult. In a remote location, core business might well be making sure there's a local dental service or a local doctor over and above picking up the garbage. So core business shifts from place to place and time to time. If you're government, then relating to other spheres of government is fundamental. Intergovernment relations is absolutely fundamental. Some guys whose work I read donkeys years ago, I think they were writing in the 1980s, said something like, local government can only be understood within a framework of the total system of government and its relations to other players in that system. You can't understand it on its own, so we've got to get the blinkers off and look at the whole system of government. That means that local leaders, yourselves, have to put the time and energy into learning about and understanding how our total system of government works. And I have to say, one of the things we learned in the New South Wales Review, no doubt things are much better here in Victoria, was how few councillors, but even more of concern in many ways, how few senior managers really had any significant idea and understanding of how the state government worked with its various agencies, let alone how the federal government worked with its agencies. And when I was running ALGA in Canberra in the 90s, same thing. People came to Canberra on deputations without really having the faintest idea who they were talking to or how to go about putting their case. And local government itself is a system. So when we're talking about building capacity, which is my headline, we've got to talk about the system of local government. It's no good building capacity in councils if we don't also build capacity in the organisations within the system of local government that they relate to and that assist them. And that includes, right at the top of that, this is a diagram out of our New South Wales report, that includes, believe it or not, ministers for local government and their departments or offices. Because if they don't have the capacity to be on top of the issues, people in councils are struggling all the time to get the message across. Because you're talking to a blancmange or brick wall or completely uncomprehending faces. So there's a whole range of people there that we said in New South Wales, we've got to look at the capacity of that as a whole. Coming to what I think Felicity Ann and Jeff Kennett would have been talking about, one of the other vital context issues here is that I think our federation in Australia is at a crossroads. In many ways it's a federation in name only. The Commonwealth is so dominant, collecting 80% of tax, calling the shots as a result on most key policy decisions and so on, that the states now, to a large degree, lack any meaningful autonomy. Even the GST, which is seen as, you know, the state's tax collected by the Commonwealth can withdraw that, can cut the amount it gives back to the states any tick of the clock. It's only an intergovernment agreement. It's not legally binding. It's not part of the Constitution. So the states are in a lot of difficulty. There are growing differentials between the states. As John mentioned, I last year was also involved in a review in South Australia. The chair of the review, Greg Crafter, a former state minister, spent a lot of the year talking to local government about how the South Australian government was going down the gurgler pretty fast. And what did that mean for local government? How were councils going to respond to a state government that lacked capacity? Who were they going to relate to? You know, all the sort of traditional notions of where you look for support, advice, expertise, etc. would have to be rethought. We've got the white paper coming up later this year. Felicity Ann, hallelujah, did get a seat on the committee that's putting the white paper together. But I think there's a very real risk, and I'm sure it'll be over her dead body, but there's a very real risk that the Abbott government will try to write a white paper which will turn the clock back. We've had 40 years since Whitlam of a bipartisan consensus in Australia that there should be direct federal-local relations as part of our federation. If you've read the Commission of Audit report, the Commission of Audit wanted to do away with that. When I was running ALGA back in '96 and John Howard came in, he wanted to do away with that. But within the government at that time, we had enough friends to avoid that consequence. Do we have enough friends in the government now? Will the states be in there saying, keep local government at the top tables? Or will the states be in there saying, no, what a good idea, you roll the local government fags into our block grants and we'll sort it out. There are some very serious questions. I've got to say, I'm not an optimist. I think there is a very real risk that the $1 billion or so that the federal government will save from the 4-year FAGS indexation freeze could turn into more in the longer term. I think anybody, quite frankly, and I know that Felicity Ann and others will put up a good fight on this, but quite frankly, I'd be preparing for significant ongoing long-term reductions in federal financial support. If it's not in core FAGs, you know, maybe roads to recovery. Commission of Audit said roads to recovery should be rolled in with other infrastructure grants to and through the states, for example. So I'm not holding my breath. So this is a diagram that I've used many times over the years. Our constitution on the left says the Commonwealth and the states are roughly equal and local government is totally buried in the states. That's the constitution. We've got used to the right-hand diagram. We've got used to the idea of a very powerful Commonwealth that works directly with local government on certain issues and in a sense is our insurance in local government against the ambitions of some states to put local government back in its place. I think there's a real risk that local government will now move back much more into the state sphere, a la a black letter reading of the Constitution. And there's a lot of black letter lawyers in the federal government. A few brief comments about the New South Wales review. Those of you who were here last year, I gave a bit of a progress report. We finally produced our final report in October of last year, and it's been subject to further discussions with local government, and a cabinet minute is I believe going up to to the Cabinet within the next few weeks. Our task on the review was to look at options for governance models, structural arrangements and boundary changes. But the important point was why. Why were we asked to look at these things? And the two principal reasons we were asked to look at them was to improve the strength and effectiveness of local government and to drive some of the key strategic directions in recent planning documents. So in fact, what we were asked to do, directly relevant to what I've been asked to talk about today, was to look at the capacity of local government and enhancing the capacity of local government. But local government as a sector and a system, not as a whole bunch of individual councils. So the goal that the panel that I chaired set itself was, and I've underlined the key words, a more sustainable system of democratic local government with added capacity to address the needs of local and regional communities and to be a valued partner of state and federal governments. We thought, in that reasonably short sentence, we hit a few bullseyes. The context for the review in New South Wales, very different to Victoria. Still 152 councils, half of them with fewer than 10,000 people, a whole bunch with fewer than 5,000 people. But nationally, of course, part of the climate of fiscal restraint, all sorts of backlogs and shortages, static or declining federal support, declining populations across most of inland New South Wales, but a series of regional capitals that are growing quite well. Increasing imbalance and inequity between LGAs. I'll come to that in just a moment, but the issue of the inequities, I would almost say the iniquities, in our system of local government at the moment was one of the things that really struck me as part of doing this review. Sydney is a global city. People in Sydney are panicking because the population projections say Melbourne is bigger in 20 years' time or 30 years' time or whatever. Nobody in Sydney really believes that, but it's a good line to push to G people up and think about metropolitan government. And the vital importance of the regional dimension because in non-metropolitan areas, and again, Dave Barry touched on this, it is critical to capacity building, especially as in New South Wales with so many small under-resourced councils, and it's also critical to state-local cooperation. I don't know how you're going here with 79, but in New South Wales, state agencies simply cannot or will not work effectively with 152 separate councils. It's just not going to happen. I put up an earlier version of this slide last year. This is really just underlining the point about the fragility of the system of local government in New South Wales. All those pink councils west of the divide, we classified on the basis of a whole range of different bits of evidence as being at risk, looking 20 odd years ahead, which was the time horizon we were given. So a number of them already teetering right on the brink of insolvency or complete incapacity. Viable in the sense that they can still open the doors tomorrow and pay the staff and pay the bills, but not sustainable in the sense that they can actually do anything very useful for their communities. So just hanging in there as units of government. And the blue ones, especially the ones on the north coast, likewise serious problems, but these are quite large councils that can probably trade their way out, although one or two of them, on all the evidence available to us, won't be able to trade their way out. But these are councils that are caught in a different mix of pressures around population growth, but low income population growth in many instances, very difficult climatic and geographical conditions that make the cost of infrastructure extremely high, and a lot of them now facing huge backlogs. I wanted to talk very briefly about inequity. This is a diagram or a table that we put in our final report. We came to this issue fairly late in our inquiry, I have to say. But I think it's a very stark table. So what you've got there is the percentage of the average residential land value that people in different local government areas pay in their council rates each year. So, if you live in Wallara, in the very affluent eastern suburbs of Sydney, sure, you pay more than $1,000 in rates on average, but it only represents 0.1% of the value of your property. Now, rates are a wealth tax. Rates are a tax, and they're a wealth tax. Rates and land tax are with a little bit of capital gains tax, are the only bits of wealth tax in our system, because we got rid of inheritance tax all those years ago, thanks to Joe Peterson. So if we want to tax wealth, we're left with property rates, land tax, and in a very small way, capital gains. So, the good burghers of Wallara pay 0.1%. If you look down to Campbelltown, a fast-growing area in the southwestern suburbs of Sydney, composed largely of a population of very low socio-economic status. The people there pay, in relative terms, relative to their wealth, they pay 5 times as much in rates as people in Wallara. Now, there are, just digressing very briefly, but this is about capacity of local government as a system. There are two, apart from the inequity, and I would suggest iniquity of these sorts of situations, there are two very significant consequences of this. One is that we need to make very significant changes to the rating system in New South Wales to even put us in a position where we're able to capture some of the lost value and lost income. The main one being that in New South Wales we rate everything on land value, not on capital improved value. So if you live in a multi-million-dollar apartment in the middle of Sydney, you can be paying the minimum rate to the City of Sydney Council. And the City of Sydney Council doesn't care, because they've got such a huge rate base, they don't need the money. Relative to their rate base and relative to their total revenue base, the City of Sydney, frankly, has 9/10 of bugger all to do. So the Lord Mayor can be a patron of the arts and, a leader of community this and that, and I've got the greatest of respect for the Lord Mayor. She does a great job. But she gets away with doing, in my view, about a quarter of the job that she should be doing, because she's got all that money flowing in and she has basically just the same responsibilities as any other council. So one consequence then is that we're foregoing a whole heap of revenue. The other critical thing that comes out of this table is that the only way, apart from obviously adjusting the rate base, the only way that we can really get that extra money that could be raised into the system of local government, where it can be used to enhance the capacity of local government as a whole and improve equity, is by changing council boundaries. Because in the eastern suburbs of Sydney we have a fragmented local government system. We in our report recommended, or not actually, I mustn't use that word. We put forward as a preferred option. We were asked to produce options and we produced options. The word recommendation didn't appear. As a preferred option, we wanted a much larger City of Sydney, and bless him, Jeff Kennett fronted up in Sydney a couple of weeks back and strongly endorsed that. I don't know whether he was strongly endorsing our report or strongly endorsing some other idea that he'd had, but anyway. But if we created a much larger city, then like Brisbane, we could give it much greater responsibilities. And the state government would save a lot of money, because at the moment the state government in New South Wales does a lot of things that an enlarged City of Sydney with expanded responsibilities a la Brisbane could be doing instead. And we could take a whole lot of stuff off the state balance sheet that could then be used to provide assistance to local governments and local communities that have far greater needs and far less ability to raise additional revenue. So inequity and the implications of inequity loomed large in our thinking towards the end of our work and are very relevant to capacity. if we're excessively fragmented, if every council is an island unto itself, blah, 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 when it comes to raising revenue and making expenditure decisions, then we are entrenching inequity, and we are, in many cases, entrenching privilege at the expense of the less privileged. I think we really, as a sector, need to understand that, because it doesn't get talked about. Okay, capacity. We waffled on in our report, and I've waffled on in talks in the past, about what we've called strategic capacity. And that was a fundamental goal of what we were doing. As I explained earlier, that's what the government asked us to come up with options to achieve. So strategic capacity, in our view, was about securing local government's future in what looked like being troubled times. It was coping with complexity and unpredictable change. It was having a more robust revenue base. It was enhancing the scope of local government to undertake new functions and major projects where there was the revenue base to sustain them. To employ a wider range of skilled staff, to exhibit, again going back to the presentation before lunch, to exhibit knowledge, superior knowledge and creativity and innovation, and to be a credible and real partner for state and federal agencies. That's what we meant by strategic capacity. We were not focused on achieving economies of scale and cost savings. We received a lot of evidence that there were economies of scale and cost savings to be achieved. And of course, we encountered strong criticism from certain illustrious academics about that. But the reason that we were not primarily focused on service delivery, on those issues, is because we were on about local government as government, not just as a service delivery. And that's a diagram that I first drew several years ago, and I need to rethink. But you know, the three words, to me, the three words, relevance, resources and credibility, encapsulate what I mean by strategic capacity. We came up then with a package of proposals. Now, to get to the nub of what I've been asked to talk to you about this afternoon, after only 20 minutes. Structural reform, we said, was necessary. The question, of course, is what sort of structural reform, and we'll come back to that. But it was just one element of what needed to be done to achieve that enhancement of strategic capacity. We needed to balance finding ways to increase capacity with the importance of keeping the local in local government, which I think is much more than a catchphrase. It's fundamental to our distinctive character and the distinctive contribution that we can make to the system of government. So we must not throw out that baby with the bathwater. We said in relation to structural reform that there were three key elements. Some amalgamations, especially in metropolitan Sydney, where, as I say, we came up with preferred options. Strong regional organisations, which I'll come to in a moment, and some new forms of local governance, which I won't have time to go into today, but which included things like picking up in a modified way aspects of the New Zealand approach to community boards, and also something which was entirely new, we think, a new kind of local council for rural areas with small populations where amalgamation is not going to be a viable option, which we call rural councils. And we set out some parameters for what you might describe as a rural council and propose that should be further explored. So this was part of our effort to make sure that we did keep the local. But the important thing was that I hope we made it clear enough in the report. Going back and reading it, I think we probably should have made this clearer. The structural reform ideas that we advanced only made sense if there were other complementary changes. They included, most importantly, something we call a fiscal responsibility agenda, which was basically about improving the quality of financial management in councils. improving the rating system, which I've already touched on. Redistribution of grant funding. I may not get out of the room alive, but we were unequivocally of the view that the per capita minimum grant guarantee just had to go. And in the interests, thank you, you must be rural.
Very different.
In the interests of equity, because as I pointed out, we have councils in inner and eastern Sydney, in fact pretty much the whole of the eastern half of Sydney, east of Parramatta, we have councils that simply don't need the money. Simply don't need the money. And we're losing, I think it's 60 or 70 million dollars a year by pouring money literally down the drain in those areas. Even the City of Sydney that I mentioned gets $5 million a year in fags and roads to recovery, and it still gets a per capita grant for its libraries from the state government. I mean, it's just bizarre. It's small change. They've got a budget of $500 million. I mean, really. Anyway, I won't go there any further. Very important issue, which I think the state government will pick up, was establishing, as exists in South Australia and Queensland, a statewide borrowing facility for councils. We had councils in New South Wales paying 7 and 8% interest in an environment where they shouldn't be paying any more than 4%. Utter madness, just profits to the banks. So there's some important issues there. Better governance frameworks, for example, looking at the role of mayors, which is another hobby horse of mine and I won't bore you with today. Picking up something else that David Barry mentioned, consistent data and benchmarking. In New South Wales, I don't know, well, I think you are better here because you've had those statewide satisfaction surveys for all these years now. New South Wales councils are absolutely horrified at the thought of serious standardised data collection, because they say, oh, we're going to have league tables. Well, shock horror. So they may actually be held accountable for not performing as well as others. That's what, when they say we don't want league tables, that's what they really mean. Just not good enough. And importantly, that changes to the state-local relationship, which I'll come back to briefly. One of the centrepieces of our proposals was in the area of regional cooperation and shared services. We commissioned a report that looked at the existing status of regional collaboration in New South Wales, particularly through regional organisations of councils, also through strategic alliances, and Donna Galvin's going to talk to you about one of the most successful of those tomorrow morning. And let me say that nothing I say should be taken as in any way being critical of Donna, for whom I have had the greatest respect for the work she's done over recent years. But she's one of the few, who is running an organisation which has made really substantial progress. On the whole, there's a lot of talk about shared services and regional collaboration, but not much real action on the ground. The reason, quite frankly, for that is that it's voluntary, and councils see it as an opt-in, opt-out. Well, yeah, okay, we like the look of that joint rates collection system, but we don't really want to extend that to collaborating on road network planning, or we don't really want to extend that into looking at broader strategic planning issues. The consequence of that is that it waxes and wanes, it's patchy, it's just not delivering what regional collaboration and really effective shared services could. So we argued that it was time to make it mandatory. But, we proposed, building on some existing legislation in New South Wales, that whilst the coming together should be mandatory, the way councils do it should be left up to them. So we suggested that there should be a series of core functions for regional collaboration, and I've listed those there, but that they would not be necessarily individually mandatory, that councils could come back and say, well, look, we think we can make a really good fist of 5 out of 6 or whatever. It would then be a matter for the councils, having negotiated amongst themselves, to negotiate with the minister to say, well, look, we've really pushed this as far as we can go. And then a proclamation would be issued by the governor creating that regional organisation. As I say, we've actually had county councils in New South Wales established along precisely these lines for many years. But we've never really looked at the potential of the governance concept that underlines them. So we had a lot of councils, for example, coming to us when we put this proposal up in our draft report, saying, well, who's going to sit on the board of the regional entity? And we said, well, that's up to you. Our preferred option is that we think all the mayors should be on the board. But if you want to add other councillors to that, or if you want your CEOs to sit alongside your mayors, that's your business. Design it. Go away and design something that's going to work for your region. This was not one size fits all. Now, sadly, from what I've seen of responses to our report, local government in New South Wales, with some very honourable exceptions, doesn't get this, and the Local Government Association doesn't appear to get it, or doesn't appear to want to get it. So whether this will fly or not, I'm not sure. We thought, though, it was the way forward to make shared services and regional collaboration an absolutely central plank of structural reform. And my personal view would be that if local government doesn't take up that opportunity, and the state government loses patience and does a Jeff Kennett or a Peter Beattie and wanders around the state crunching amalgamations in 18 months' time, well, who have they got to blame? The other very important element of this is that we actually, as a review panel, reached an agreement with the Premier's department, which is responsible for government, cross-agency coordination within the state, and has a specific regional development and coordination program. We actually negotiated with them that these new local government regional bodies would have seats at the top table, that there would be genuine partnership agreements entered into between the Premier's department and the local councils involved, and various other things would flow. So the benefits of this, we thought, were very, very considerable, but as I say, whether this goes ahead is in the balance. Time, I think, is against me. I won't go through the detail with that. Okay, I wanted to finish with just a few slides to just reflect on some of the evidence around what I've been saying. In other words, don't take my word for it, is what I'm suggesting to you. We reviewed a mass of evidence. We looked at God knows how many reports and journal articles and whatever, and we commissioned new research of our own. As I've said, it's quite clear that there's no single right approach to structural reform. There are a series of ways you can go about it. Amalgamations and shared services, regional collaboration are the two principal avenues of structural reform that we talk about in local government. The evidence says that both of those may succeed, and do succeed in some instances, and may fail and do fail in some instances. The fundamental questions you've got to ask yourself when you're deciding what options to look at for your region or your area are: what do you want local government to do? Do you accept what's been described in New South Wales as the maximalist position, that local government is government and has a whole raft of stuff and has a broad role to play? Or are you going to try, and I think it's a King Canute attempt, but don't take my word for it, are you going to try it on a back to basics, we just deliver services, so don't call us approach? And what are the objectives of your structural reform process? Do you want to enhance your capacity so that you can be a more significant player, do more and different things for your community, or do you just want to cut the costs and keep the rates down? And of course, a lot of the discussion about amalgamation has revolved around the fact that the evidence says it's not very good at cutting costs and keeping the rates down. We'll come back to that in a moment. One of the things that we found in our review, looking at the evidence and talking to people in local government, not only in New South Wales but around the country, is that the process of structural reform is absolutely critical. If structural reform is, on one hand, half-hearted and patchy, or on the other hand, local councils being beaten around the head with a big stick, and as happened in New South Wales in 2004, getting a fax at 8:45 in the morning saying, oh, by the way, from 9 o'clock you're the new council of ... It's not going to work. It's not going to work. We have to look at much more robust processes that are built on a sound information base, that have an extended period of consultation, proper pre-planning, and robust governance arrangements. Whether we're going down the amalgamation route or the shared services route, those 4 needs still apply. And last year, those of you who were here, there was a terrific paper by Greg Hoffman from the Queensland Local Government Association that compared the processes in Queensland back in the 90s with the Beattie process, and Greg made a lot of these points. Eventually, even with a crunching process, and you know this all too well in Victoria, you do come out the other side of it. And on the whole, the results are pretty good. And we found the same in New South Wales from the much more limited crunching in 2004. But you can avoid a lot of that pain and angst if you pre-plan and consult properly in advance. And that was Greg's message last year. In terms of the evidence, when I was the director of the Centre of Excellence, we put out this report on consolidation. I think I showed you this last year, and I just wanted to highlight there in blue our conclusions based on a huge range of evidence in relation to generating efficiency and economies of scale, generating strategic capacity, and avoiding taking the local out of local government. And the point I want to make is there's not a lot of difference. There's not a lot of difference in the overall findings of those. It's a matter of what works best in different circumstances. But what is crucial, as I've just said, is the process, getting the decision-making right, and getting the ongoing governance arrangements right. Amalgamations, just very briefly, the benefits are not automatic. Brian Dollery has been telling us all for years now that there's no simple relationship between size of council and efficiency. Accept that completely. And therefore, you don't always get efficiencies and savings out of amalgamations, and they can be very messy, costly, disruptive. I think that's typically a result of bad process more than anything. There may be a difference, which Brian argues, between forced mergers and voluntary mergers. He's written at least 1 or 2 papers that suggest that if it is a voluntary merger, it gets better results. Again, I think that's because if it's a voluntary merger, by definition, it's been taken more slowly, the process has been more consultative, more care has gone into thinking through the ongoing governance arrangements. And I've looked, for example, at the merger of Geraldton and Greenock in Western Australia some years ago, which ticks all those boxes. However, there is a wide range of studies, including some by Brian and his colleagues, which do point to significant benefits of amalgamations in terms of economies of scale, in terms of economies of scope and increased capacity, and in terms of enhanced sustainability. So amalgamations can deliver in the right place with the right process. And this was really, a lot of that was crystallised in a study in 2010 by Ian Tiley, now Dr. Ian Tiley. It was his PhD work, and interestingly, he did this PhD work with Brian Dollery as a supervisor. And there are 2 of Ian's key conclusions, which I think support the view that amalgamations can enhance what I've called strategic capacity. So the first quote, these are direct quotes from Ian's book. The larger organisation has been able to increase outputs and projects that were beyond the capacity of the former councils. It's developed the capacity to deliver services over a wider footprint than its LGA. There is sufficient evidence to suggest that the financial strength and stability of Clarence Valley Council is now greater than that of each of the former councils. So it is stronger, more capable. And the ultimate conclusion, the weight of empirical evidence proves that the economic benefits have outweighed the fiscal disadvantages of this amalgamation. At least from a fiscal standpoint, bigger is indeed better, but not obviously cheaper. I'll just leave you to ponder that. The costs of amalgamations are often referred to as being, over the top. This was looked at closely in the case of the Queensland amalgamations. The Treasury Corporation there went back and did a review of the costs. And to cut to the chase, there was a lot of argument about what was a cost of amalgamation and what wasn't. And the biggest argument was if the new council decided to adopt the wage and salary structure of the best from that point of view of the former councils and thereby increased its costs, was that a cost of amalgamation or was that a cost of the new council caving into the unions or whatever? So that there was a lot of debate about that. But down at the bottom there, I think what the QTC review did was it put into perspective the costs. On its calculation, all the councils concerned had the financial capacity to meet the costs because they represented only 0.3 to 1.5% of operating revenues over the first 4-year period, I think it was. Now, if you say that there's no way you can get away with not paying the salaries and wages of the previous highest paying council, you may be able to multiply that by 3 or 4. So 0.3 to 1.5 at the very most might go to 1.2 to 6, or perhaps more realistically to 0.9 to 4.5. But that would still be, I think, within the perceived capacity to meet those costs. This argument is being tossed around in Perth as we speak. Shared services, a few very brief points. And again, these are direct quotes from different reports. And look, I don't want to seem to be giving Brian Dollery a big serve, but I want to, because I've used all his quotes, my purpose being to emphasise that there is no right answer here. There is no right answer. And the research shows that because different bits of research come up with different conclusions. And even someone like Brian, who is so publicly opposed to amalgamations, has some cautionary words to say about shared services. The first quote there, there's Brian's view of the world in the first line. Compulsory consolidation seldom achieves its intended aims. Blah, blah, blah. The best way to achieve larger scale economies. But the critical words there, I should underline them, are in these selected functional areas. So what Brian is saying is that collaborative shared services are good in certain aspects of council's operations, certain service delivery aspects. But my question is, can you then claim that shared services enhances local government with all the other things it does? If it's government and it does a whole lot of stuff beyond service delivery, is an approach which focuses only on some aspects of service delivery really enhancing the capacity of our system of local government? That, I think, is the question. And then Brian, in that same book, the concluding sentence, I think this was, of the book, it's important not to oversell this message by way of exaggerated claims for what shared services models can realistically achieve. Shared services models have their limitations which must be recognised. And I think there are just so many examples of shared services arrangements, not achieving what they were meant to achieve and in many cases falling over after a few years. And then in another piece of work, Brian says the degree of success varied considerably from case to case, and then touches on, I think, a very important issue. There are often significant barriers to the implementation of shared services which are difficult to overcome, including the loss of local identity. So shared services is not a guaranteed way of maintaining local autonomy and identity, because you have to sacrifice something to get the benefits. The complexity of the processes involved, conflicting objectives between participating councils, and uncertainty surrounding potential benefits. So like amalgamations, they work sometimes in the right circumstances with goodwill, and other times they don't. And we've had that, those findings confirm exactly the findings of the work that we commissioned as part of the New South Wales review. And I guess the most spectacular example in New South Wales of those qualifications coming sadly true was the establishment and subsequent failure of the New England Strategic Alliance of Councils, which fell apart because it just didn't come to terms with those points that Brian makes in that third quote. Brian then, in another piece of work, went on to actually propose something very similar to the joint organisation model that we finally put forward in our report, called a joint board model. And what this was kind of shared services plus. It was not only do you have to share service delivery, but you should share a whole administration. So he's saying you can keep your local political organisations, but to get the benefits, you share the whole of the administration. Joint CEO, joint everything. That was interestingly came from an idea advanced by the former Shires Association in New South Wales some years ago, but hasn't been pursued. So, my conclusions, my apologies for going a couple of minutes over. My conclusions are these: that local government faces an uncertain future. We've got the fiscal constraints, we've got shifting intergovernment arrangements. To face that future with any degree of confidence, we need as a sector to think hard about we're going to enhance our capacity as a sector, as a system of government, not just as a series of councils. We've got to be able, I believe, to take a more independent stance. I think we should be putting more effort into looking at how we can improve than campaigning to get our grants back. I'm not saying we shouldn't campaign to get our grants back, but anybody who's putting all their eggs in that basket, in my view, is barking up the wrong tree. And we've got to ensure that we are seen to be credible in an ongoing way as a valuable part of the Australian federal system. If we lose that credibility, then it's just a steady decline into being branch offices of state agencies. Further structural reform has a very important role to play in this endeavour of maintaining local government's place in the system. And such structural reform must be multidimensional. And I think this applies much less in Victoria than it does in New South Wales and some other states. It really is time to stop drawing battle lines between proponents of amalgamation and people who say shared services will fix it all, and other approaches to structural reform. That kind of approach is pointless, it achieves nothing, and it's damaging because A, it shows local government as just bickering amongst itself, and B, it means that we are not taking the trouble to find the right solutions to clearly defined problems in different locations. So we need as a sector a much more mature, evidence-based conversation about what type of reform we have to apply in different circumstances. And as I said earlier, the most important thing that I learned in doing the New South Wales review is we've got to make sure in each of our states and the Northern Territory that we have a sound process in place, a process agreed with the state government for reviewing these issues as and when they're put on the table. Thanks a lot. Look, I'm not going to tell other states what's what. What we found very clearly in New South Wales was that there were really three types of council, if you like, from a financial assistance point of view. There were the ones, as you rightly say, who don't need it, and the Productivity Commission demonstrated that conclusively 7 years ago now, 2007. So there's no, and the Henry Tax Review subsequently said it, there really is no justification for splashing so much money around on an as-of-right basis. Incidentally, the Commonwealth Grants Commission looked at this issue last year. They reported to the Federal Treasurer in December to the best of my knowledge, their report has yet to see the light of day. Could have some interesting things to say. Ask your local MP. So that's one group. The second group are councils that I would describe as deserving. And they're deserving in two respects. One is they're deserving because they're facing major problems, and the other is that they're deserving because they're doing something to help themselves. Way back, the Hawker report on cost shifting, everybody remember that? The Hawker report actually said this. It said, let's channel more of the money to councils who need it, but only if there's evidence that they can become sustainable and are doing what they can to enhance their own sustainability and capacity. It was a great recommendation, should have been followed up way back then and wasn't. And the third group, and I'm absolutely blunt about this, and you probably don't have any, well, you might have one or two in Victoria, but we've got a whole a truckload of them in New South Wales, are councils that, when you look realistically at their future prospects, just cannot continue to function as fully fledged local governments for another 20 plus years. We looked at those councils at risk that I mentioned include a large number of those. Frankly, it's tough love, I know. I wouldn't be splashing large amounts of money at those councils unless we can find some much more effective ways of delivering services at a reasonable cost to their communities. But just maintaining a whole bunch of separate organisations with umpteen unnecessary CEOs and chief engineers and councillors and mayors and cars and office blocks and I just don't think we should be using public money in a situation where the future is frankly pretty hopeless, and where we can do better. This is my key point, where we can do better for those communities by using the money in other ways. So those would be my three groups. I would be transferring as much as the policymakers will let me from the don't need it's to the deservings, and I would be looking at new ways of providing good quality local governance and service delivery to the basket cases, if I can use that phrase. Thank you.
Last question, Rick.
Yep.
Thanks, Chris Venno, A couple of years ago, there was a study, apparently it was one of the major international consulting firms that looked at a variety of shared services settings across the globe in different places. In terms, again, of what worked and what didn't work, the clear finding was that those projects that were driven by the desire to build capacity, build capability worked, where it was driven by short-term, let's say, the buck here or there, that was where the problem was.
Yep.
Now that very much aligns generally, obviously, with your theme about capacity building. I think actually prefer to come cases where things took a bit longer, they worked a bit better. So I'm just wondering your reaction generally to that approach, to what we should be doing is, we know that the immense pressure we're going to be facing, but avoid the quick cut, and let's always remember that what we are doing is building capacity and capability and using those as drives to get the real success and avoid pitfalls.
Well, look, I just agree with you 100%. And what we tried to do in the New South Wales report was, along those lines, in addition to proposing a new process for considering various approaches of structural reform, not just amalgamations but shared services approaches as well, was also to set out a series of principles which the government ought to endorse as to what we're trying to achieve, and what the government will, if you like, endorse and support as the right way of going about it. And that mirrors exactly the point that you've made.